minutes time. For those of you who joined us last week, this is the second webinar in the series. The series is about how COVID-19, this huge change that we're seeing to the economy, to the way we work, to society, to everything all around us, how COVID-19 is disrupting marketing and sales. And today we're going to be looking at the second topic in the series, which is about how it's disrupting pricing effectively. So we're going to be discussing that, really looking forward to diving into this very meaty topic. Those of you who registered, you will have seen that there was a webinar and there was an event protocol. And just to build on that, a couple of things that we would suggest. If you want to raise a question at any point, particularly when we come to the Q&A, then we'd ask that you either raise your hand digitally, and there is a way to do that on Zoom by selecting one of the various reactions, which you'll see in the bar at the bottom of the screen. Or if you want to, you can just physically put your hand up and I will look out for you, and Jubril will look out for you, and we'll make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak and ask their questions. So before we get started, we sent around some food for thought. So a quick question to get everyone thinking about today's topic. And that was a very simple question. Name one way that COVID-19 has changed your organisation's pricing. So we'd love to hear some examples of that. It's often been said that pricing is an art rather than a science, and everyone's obviously having to look at how they price their products and services at the moment. So who would like to share an example of how their organisation's pricing has changed during this time? Has anyone got an example they'd like to share? Don't be shy, we would love to hear how things have changed. Or if you prefer, you can put the example in the chat if that's easier for you.
I think perhaps, Zoe, it's Richard here, that we might find that one of the issues with COVID-19 is it has a very different impact on pricing from historical recessions and economic issues. And actually, one of the conclusions we might reach from today is that making knee-jerk reactions in pricing to COVID-19 might not be the right way forward. So it may be that everyone's doing exactly the right things already.
Yes, well, hopefully they are. Great. So yes, I hope that we will find out how some organisations might have changed, and also how some might not during the crisis as well, because in some industries I'm sure there's a very good case to hold firm actually and to maintain your pricing. Perhaps even in some very high demand industries you might even be looking at raising your pricing, thinking about that conversation Richard and Janet we had on last week. So it'd be really interesting to hear how this is playing out across a number of different sectors. Okay, so with that in mind, hopefully we'll be hearing some more examples later, but why don't we move on to the discussion? Before I do that, just to quickly recap on the format, we will be spending the next 20 minutes or so hearing a bit more from the speakers about their stories, their case studies of how they've been grappling with this topic around pricing and what changes they have put into place or not, and why those changes have happened. So I will introduce you to our speakers in a moment. We'll do a bit of Q&A for the next 20 minutes after that. Then we'll have some questions from you, the delegates. I'm sure there'll be lots of things that you want to ask our panel. And then following that, there'll be a quick exercise just to put learnings into practice from today. And then finally, we'll do a quick wrap up of the session and then hear about what we'll be covering in the webinar next week. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two fantastic panellists. Very, very pleased to be joined by them today. Janet Efere, who some of you may know, I think some of her learners are here today, which is great news. Janet is the founder, primary sales coach and trainer at Tadpole Training. She's got a fantastic story because she started her business in 2013 with no money, no home and 2 small children, but with an unshakable belief that she could help ordinary business owners sell more. And at the beginning, it was so tough she couldn't afford internet at home and spent her days in McDonald's to use the Wi-Fi there. Since then, Janet's gone on to huge success. By the end of 2016, she reached the finals of 3 national competitions. She's been featured in The Guardian. She won the Enterprise Enfield Startup Business of the Year, and she's rapidly becoming go-to expert on all matters sales related, and has a real passion for working with entrepreneurs. And I hear that those entrepreneurial skills and values are one of the most important routes out of the crisis. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that today from Janet. We're also very pleased to be joined again by Richard Goodwin, who I'm sure many of you know. Richard's career has spanned 20 years in marketing, sales and strategy roles in British Steel and the stationery office. And since 2015, Richard has been managing director of the JGA Group, leading it to the West London Business Award for Best Education and Training Provider in 2019. In recent years, JGA has expanded in an entrepreneurial fashion, building completely new types of training provision and facing changes which have helped it adapt its marketing mix to the COVID-19 era. Welcome, Janet, and welcome, Richard.
Good to be here, thank you.
Very pleased to have you both here. Obviously, pricing is such a huge topic, and we've already started to talk a little bit about how there are some organisations who will have to change a lot, and perhaps some who may even be able to go in a more positive direction, or perhaps even maintain pricing. Richard, can I start with you just to pick up on that point? How can organisations work out the right thing to do about pricing at the moment, where they need to be flexible, and how they can tie that to what customers want?
I think pricing is very much horses for courses. So usually in a recession, or when demand goes down in an industry you're working in, they means that supply stays roughly the same. Fewer people want to buy, or they want to buy less, which means that the suppliers compete on price, amongst other things, to try and grab a larger share of that demand. With COVID, in some industries, and it's not in all industries, it's not the same, because a lot of your clients, depending on your sector, have just disappeared for a month or for 2 months. If a restaurant is closed, it doesn't matter what price you're offering to sell them a alcoholic drink at, for example, they ain't going to buy, because they ain't selling, and therefore price is not the material consideration in that purchasing decision. And so therefore, I think it very much depends on knowing your industry. And the flip side is, if you are a loo roll manufacturer, and at the time when there was a shortage of loo rolls, do you want to price gouge, as they call it? Do you want to double your prices? Will your consumers or your supermarket clients remember that that's what you did, and get their revenge in 6 months' time when we're past the peak? But that doesn't mean to say there's necessarily nothing you should be doing on pricing, but it's saying that simple raising and lowering of prices needs to be thought of in a very specific COVID context. It very much depends on your sector, though. Other ways to look at that, for example, in the last recession we're in, the great financial crash, I think it was Hyundai that sold cars on a finance package. I think it was 0% interest, but they put a proviso in that if you lost your job, you could return the car. So essentially, they were using a pricing mechanism to try and inject some sort of security and address their customers' fears, because customers won't buy a car if they're worried about losing their job. If you can take that fear away, then that, which essentially is a pricing issue, goes away as well. So there are lots of things that can be done around pricing, I think, and some of them no doubt come out later on. But I think a simple stick it up or stick it down probably isn't the right answer to COVID.
Thank you, Richard. That's really interesting. Janet, what's your take on this issue then?
Really similar. I think at the beginning, in the early days, you remember when we were about 2-3 days into it, Joe Wicks was everywhere doing stuff for free, and a lot of the entrepreneurs I work with were panicking because there's stuff out there for free. How can I continue to charge? And I noticed a massive wobble of confidence in people over those early days. It has settled down, but I completely agree with everything Richard said, because some stuff, if you can't get it, it's going to cost more. I mean, one of the reasons PPE is so expensive is that supply and demand thing, but also there's a bit of opportunism in there too. And I completely agree. We will remember who ripped us off. we will remember who supported us. And also there's things that we couldn't have predicted, because for example, at the moment, who'd have thought hot tubs are in demand, but it makes sense because people are at home. Similarly, things like scented candles. A couple of weeks ago I was queuing outside Aldi, and the queue for Halfords was longer than the queue for the supermarket because people want bikes. So it does depend on what people want, but you're not really going to know unless you ask questions. So with my sales hat on, I think you've just got to have conversations with your customers and say what's happening with pricing at the moment in your world, because we don't exist as islands. We depend on the supply chain, we depend on supply and demand, we depend on, there might be lots of it, but can we get it? There are so many factors that come into account. So I think we've got to have really good conversations, honest conversations with people. How's lockdown treating you? What's it doing to your business? See what they say.
And I think, Janet, taking on that a stage further, it depends on your relationship with your customers. If you are a importer exporter, and PPE is one of your things, and somebody, doesn't matter who, supermarket chain or a person or an organization who has never bought PPE before approaches you for PPE because they're desperate because it's COVID, you'd stick your prices up, quite frankly. Well, your factories in China are probably sticking their prices up. If it's someone you have a long-term relationship with, so you may have been supplying a hospital for 20 years, and you want to supply them for another 20 years, you do not stick your prices up except to maybe reflect your costs if they have gone up.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I've got a client who's in exactly that position. So he's always he's in the branded branded workwear market. So PPE is appropriate for him, and he was worried because China's put his wholesale price up 4 times, and he's worried about his reputation if he increases his price by a similar amount, but he's got to if he's going to sell it. And what I always recommend to people like that is you have got to tell your customers why the price has gone up. It's not just you being greedy. There are actual commercial reasons that you don't have a choice.
There are ways in that sort of situation. When I worked in the steel industry, the stainless steel has a lot of additional metals and minerals added to it to make it stainless. And what they used to do was have a surcharge. So they'd have a basic price for the underlying steel, and then a surcharge that reflects the price of the extra minerals that were added. So for example, in that case, for example, he could say, well, our base price is X, and our suppliers have put it up by £100 for 5 costumes or whatever it happens to be. So this is what I'm presenting to you, and this is what I'm selling. So you can see that it's not me trying to make a load of extra money, and that's partly about how you tell the story and the transparency in your pricing process, which you, depending on your organization and your product, you may or may not wish to have more transparency in the pricing process. But to challenge those sorts of issues, that's the way to do it, or one way to do it.
Yeah.
So just on both of those points, because I think what's really interesting, what's already emerging out of this conversation about how that underlying relationship with the customer is so key. Do either of you have any tips on how to have those conversations about pricing? Janet, shall we come back to you because you raised the point?
I think really what COVID-19 has done for the sort of zeitgeist, if you like, is we've had to show that we're a little bit more caring than we used to. Now, I found people are really open to have conversations. So whereas before it might have been a 2 or 3 minute conversation, I'm easily having 20, 30 minute conversations with people now. And I think you use this as an opportunity to really get stuck in there and to ask those questions. Like I said, how is lockdown treating you? What impact has it had on price? What challenges are you facing? And get inside their shoes. And if you have a sales team, get the sales team's feedback, because they're on the front line. They know what's happening with the customers, and you'll start to observe trends, and that will help you make judgments. But I think the simplest way is to genuinely show them that you're trying to help, you're in it with them, help me understand. I have always said, in my personal role as a sales trainer, I have always said, look, I know my value, so I won't give you a discount, but I will help you pay. And I've been using that strategy recently, and I think people appreciate it. if you are confident that you're charging the right price and you don't want to change it, then actually you can probably stick with it. But it does depend on your sector, and don't get me wrong, I completely understand that.
Thank you. That's interesting. Richard, have you got any thoughts on how we can build those stronger relationships with customers at this critical time to have those price conversations?
I think COVID has led to a dichotomy, basically. It's fairly binary. Either people are, well, maybe there's three options. So either people on furlough, in which case officially you can't talk to them, and some people are delighted to chat and other people are just off limits, either because they want to be or because they feel that's what the rules will dictate. Or people are working from home and they're frantically busy trying to keep the place going, because adapting to that sort of change for some people isn't that easy. Or they're at home and they have extra time to chat, and absolutely getting to know your customers. And I think it goes back as well, that Hyundai example from earlier. There are industries where if you are a landlord, for example, and your tenants are shops, then maybe the pricing thing you do is not to cut the price. Maybe you defer payment and you say, okay, no payments for 2 months, and then you pay me over the next 12 months or something like that. But again, that depends on relationships. If you think that your client, the shop, is a great shop and once through this will go places and take you with them and occupy that for 20 years, and there may be a variable element to payment, so if you get lots of sales through the shop, you get extra money, then it might be worth backing them. Or it might be a dead-end mob that you think will be out of business anyway within 6 months, then you're not inclined to do them any favors. So that comes back again to absolutely knowing them. And it's not just knowing the relationship, it's knowing something about their finances as well. If you are going to defer payments or do someone a favor, you want to know they're going to be around in 6 months' time to repay it. If they're going bust, then it doesn't. You've just lost out by not being hard in the first place. So whether that is credit checking, or if you're at a big company, they often use credit insurance for their big clients, or other mechanisms, or just looking at company's house at their balance sheet to understand whether it has loads of debt or loads of cash. It's when you're making a pricing decision, especially if it's not just, well, even if it's a case of up and down, what you're doing is taking a bet on the future to some degree, and make sure you understand all the ramifications of that bet.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, and as you've both alluded to there, obviously there's a really something quite important about the sort of trust that you have between you and the customer, and how you can have those really frank conversations at a time like this. So thinking about if you're in an industry where there is some element of competition at the moment, should we be competing on price or not, and how could that affect perceptions of the quality of our product? Janet, do you want to kick us off on that topic?
I dive straight in with a no. I don't think we should ever compete on price unless you're in the equivalent of an industry that's like the pound shop, and you've got a sort of pilot high, sell them cheap model. I don't think you should, because that's what differentiates you. When people buy cheap, they understand that they're sacrificing things. So, the obvious one is quality, but it could be turnaround. It could be, will you physically be trading in 3 months' time if something goes wrong? So I think you've got to really hammer home the benefits and the value of what it is that you offer. So this is where things like reputation, having a customer service team, quality, accreditations, insurance, all the things that mean that you cost more are there to protect the customer. So you make sure you hammer it home. And do you know what? Something that often works, especially if you can do it in a really sort of sage and knowledgeable way, you can just say, well, at the end of the day, buy cheap, buy twice. And a lot of people do get that.
Yeah, very good point. Richard, what do you think?
It very much depends on the industry you're in. At one end of the spectrum, you've got a Rolls Royce. And if you're paying, I don't know how much Rolls Royce costs, £400,000 for a car, if someone knocks 50 or 100 grand off the price, are they more likely to buy it than the German equivalent, whose name I can't remember, or the Bugatti or something like that? And I don't know the answer, but I suspect people aspire to a Rolls Royce, or you aspire to a Bugatti, and the odd 50 grand when you're up in those rarefied heights probably ain't going to make any difference. At the other extreme, if you're selling a commodity product, if you're a petrol station and your oil price has just gone down from $30, $40, $50 a time to $10 a time, then clearly there is price competition, and it's impossible for a petrol station to add so much value that they can get away from price entirely. They might be able to hike it up a bit because they're on the motorway and people won't go off the motorway, and therefore you can charge a few extra pence per litre. But you cannot make it price insensitive in the ideal way that Janet's talking about. And everyone else is in that spectrum. So there'll be industries where they're more price sensitive or they're less price sensitive, and everyone will have marketing departments working really hard to try and move to the right of that spectrum, whereby they're moving to the less price sensitive end. However, of course, what you give away in other services and things might cost just as much as giving it away on price. It just depends on what you do and the amounts of commoditization of your products.
Mm-hmm. And actually, you just made me think of something, Richard, too. I mean, whereas if you're selling B2B, clearly there are businesses that are really struggling. So I'm going back to the original point about if your customers aren't in a position to buy, it doesn't really matter anyway. But B2C, individuals, whether they're furloughed or whether the world's just changed a bit. We were talking about this before we came on air. We're not really buying very much because we're limited. Where can we go? The supermarket, that's kind of it. So the things people are spending money on are often the luxury end of the market, because actually now we've got more disposable income because we're not commuting, because we're not accruing expenses, because we're not going to the cinema, to restaurants, on holidays. So you may well find that in the B2C environment, actually the market can cope. And again, I'm generalizing, and I know I am, but it's something to bear in mind, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? To think about how some of those trends might play out in the B2B world versus the B2C world, especially as it feels like even September is a long way away, and we don't know yet what that new world exactly is going to look like, particularly when things like some further changes come into play. Fantastic, great. So I've seen that there's already at least one question posted in the chat, so that feels like a really good moment to start to invite people to share their questions. Biddy, I know that you just posted a question, so do you want to read it out for us, because it looked like a great one to get the discussion going?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Some really lovely points coming out from both our guest speakers there about relationship building, the trust, and the trading price confidence. So thank you for that. My question is really, do you think we're in a world at the moment where we have a combinational strategy, whether it's tactical or long-term, in terms of marginal and market pricing strategies? Would that be fair to say, or do you think the strategies are going to be varied right across every sector?
Gosh, that's how long is a piece of string question, isn't it? It's just look, I think it does vary across sector. Look, let me give you an example. Hairdressers. You'd think on the face of it, hairdressers work has fallen off a cliff, but I know some smart hairdressers who, right when it began, started booking in when lockdown finishes, you can have the first slot, and they charged a premium, which is quite reactive, but actually is rather clever, and I think people understand that. I am seeing some really creative things going on with pricing. I'm actually not sure I can answer that question. I think it's very varied. I've seen some really interesting things going on. What do you think, Richard?
I think this is a recession unlike any we've had before. This is a recession where everything just suddenly stopped. It hasn't been a gradual decline of increased competition. It's been a case of either stuff is operating or ain't operating in a lot of cases. Obviously, there are some sectors that are terribly badly hit. And if you're working with that sector, you are just very unlucky and a bit stuffed in the short term. But there are other sectors which, of course, are sailing through pretty unimpacted. Yes, they're impacted in terms of commute to work and things, but in terms of their normal business, and I think it's absolutely horses for courses. And I think in a lot of sectors, the right thing to do will be nothing in terms of pricing, unless new insights arise or behaviour changes. It may be going forward in commercial property, for instance, if more people are working from home and therefore what people want from their offices changes. It may be that there are more flexible pricing models that will gradually go into there, more sort of like WeWork. Well, this is a bit ironic given the financial travails of WeWork itself. But in a lot of sectors, I think there's either demand or there ain't. And I don't think it will have as big an impact on pricing as previous recessions have. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, because we're in unprecedented times where previous models of strategies, not gone out the window, but definitely having to be looked at, looking at a combination of things. And I think the hairdressers probably got it quite right with their reactive forward planning, and we wait to see what happens with the commercial properties, because a lot of that might be dependent upon the feedback from staff, of how they've managed to adapt to working from home and things like that, for decisions to be made at higher level. So thank you, that was really good. Thank you very much.
It's planning for that kind of flexibility, isn't it? Which seems like a challenge as much as an opportunity in many ways. Brilliant, great. So who else has questions? Please feel free to either put your hand up and we will come to you, or if you prefer to put your question in the chat, you're also very welcome to do that. Who else has a question that they would like to ask? Has anyone else got a question?
May I ask a question for discussion?
Go for it, Richard.
Do we think that in a setting where we don't usually think of price as a big mechanism, like care, for example, do we think that COVID-19 will have an impact on care pricing? What am I asking this? I'm asking this because clearly for care homes, for example, there are cost increases. Clearly it is an industry that does not have a huge amount of money at the moment, and it is price governed because usually it's the government that pays, and the government is really stingy, and was already complaining that it didn't have sufficient money. And there have been real increases in costs. They're about to get all the flack from people dying in care homes. Will that impact how much people are willing to pay for care when it's being paid by you or me or other people? Do you have a view yourself, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because there's some interesting models that I've seen coming out from other countries. So there was a news article I was reading a while ago about Japan. This was at least a year ago, definitely pre-pandemic, and it was about how if you I think put a certain amount of hours into volunteering or helping your community in Japan, then you effectively start to create some credits that will go towards paying for your social care bill when you're older, and I thought that was quite an interesting example of where people are then incentivized to contribute to wider society, which obviously is very much a trend that I'm hoping will stay as we move beyond the pandemic, and then how people start to really perceive the value of the care that they are going to get in later years. So I do hope we're going to see much more of a debate about those issues, given that care homes have obviously had such a really difficult time during the pandemic. Janet, do you have a view on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, I must admit, it's not an area that I have a great knowledge of. I mean, they in one way, they've just been hit from all directions, haven't they? So their costs are up now. They're probably struggling with staff. That, the fact that so many people have been dying in care homes, that creates, the brutal truth is there's admin to do with stuff like that. And then you've got deep cleaning, you've got rules, and you've got goodness knows what to deal with it. I think they're really going to struggle. I really do. But there may be the appetite amongst the general population to change it politically so that they are more supportive. I'll be interested to see what happens. But I feel for them at the moment. I think they must be having a terrible time.
It's a market which should be not very price sensitive, because it should be all about quality, and especially if you're paying and it's your parents or something, not your parents, one's parents, then clearly you really care about what the care home. But actually, in a lot of cases, the local authority is paying, and therefore it's all about price, as far as I understand it. Once you've got a tick in the box that you're a legit care home, it's all about price negotiation.
Yeah, and I didn't realise this, but apparently at the moment with COVID, when someone dies in a care home, they literally burn possessions to prevent the risk of infection with whoever takes the room on next. Because I have a client who does deep cleaning services, and she's trying to pitch that they could deep clean everything so the family can at least have their things back. Now, I can see that in a council-run care home, they might not be prepared to stomach that extra cost. They might just say, well, it's easier to get rid of it and destroy it. So there's all sorts of levels and subtleties to this one. I think it's complicated.
And I think that's maybe one of the messages that's come through today generally, which is price often is complicated. It's not just a case of it £1.50 or £1.35 or £2 or £2 million.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other things that make a difference. And the fact that COVID has just shut down large parts of the economy, taking away demand entirely, means that price actually, in a conventional up and down sense, is a much less effective determinant of demand, of volume, of supply.
Yeah, really interesting point. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question for the panel, or even an opportunity or challenge they would like to share that they faced about pricing over the last few weeks?
Give us some challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some challenges. Because look, I mean, I can't see if any of my cohorts are here, but you know, my background is sales, so this is real frontline stuff for me. So, you know, please, if you're having any specific challenges with price, pop it in the chat box, and you know, if we can help, we will.
There we go. Janet is game for a challenge.
Yeah.
Or opportunities.
Or opportunities, exactly.
Now, obviously, you're going to make them really complicated, but whatever comes is good.
Excellent. Thank
Or,
you.
I mean, it might also be useful to put down. I did a post on LinkedIn this morning, funny enough, thinking about this. And what might be quite interesting, something you could all do in the chat, is this is the question: what's happened to your pricing? So, A, has it increased? B, has it dropped? Or C, has it stayed the same? It might be quite interesting if everyone would just type A, B, or C, and then we get a bit of a snapshot.
Janet, can you just recap what A, B, and C are? I see
So
Peter's already put C.
A, it's gone up. B, it's gone down. C, it stayed the same. Okay, so yeah, we're getting some feedback now. So quite a lot of people have stayed the same. Anil's price has gone up. Interesting. So any Bs? No one seems to have dropped. We've got a very savvy lot of people on the webinar.
Interesting. Anil, given that you're an A, can you tell us a bit more about that? Anil, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yeah. Sorry I had to join halfway through, but I had an unexpected conference call that we had to attend. Funny
No
enough.
problem.
So what I understand halfway through is that we're discussing certain prices that may have gone up due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, go on.
We've been impacted massively by the wheat market. Global uncertainty is one of the reasons that this has happened. So we've found that countries are quite limiting their exports quite a bit. So Russia, for example, has limited their exports for the second quarter of this year. With the uncertainty going on, we have seen an increase, and we've had to pass that on to customers on our flour, and we've also had to do a similar sort of thing on rice as well, which hasn't gone down very well with our trade, whether it's cash and carries or retailers.
That's really interesting. Rich, sorry, you're about to say something?
I was going to say, can Anil tell us where he works, so that give everyone a reference in terms, or at least the industry sector?
Sure. So I work as part of ABF. Sector that I work in is ethnic foods. So that is the Indian and Chinese market we concentrate in and supply key lines. So from flour to rice to noodles, sauces and pastes. Some of the brands you might recognize, Elephant Attar, Patak's Pace and Pickles we own. So we've seen and a whole load of rice brands as well, which we have had quite challenging conversations with customers. We're delivering to the restaurant takeaway side, customers such as multiples like Tesco, etc. And then we've also got key retailers in the channel as well, and especially with the restaurant takeaway side not looking so great at the moment, when we're trying to put in price increases on top of that with already struggling distributors, it's not going down very well.
So you missed this bit, Anil, I know, because I admitted you, I think. The challenge you have is the sort of challenge that Janet was describing earlier with her swimsuit manufacturer friend. So his problem was his supplier was putting their prices up in China, and he was worried about being seen to be, for want of a better phrase, insulting his customers by putting his prices up or her prices up at this difficult time. And one of the things we discussed was about giving some sort of transparency to the client about why the prices were going up, to show that it's not you price gouging. You're not saying, well, you're desperate for swimming costumes, so we're going to charge twice as much. Actually, it's saying, this is the price of our swimming costumes. It hasn't changed. However, our supplier has put the amount, their charges up by X amount. Ergo, we've got to put our prices up by X amount. And are you doing work around that sort of transparency with your customers?
Yeah, so to that point, what I kind of done is looked at the market for the last year. So if we concentrate on flour and the wheat market, so what I did, I looked at where we were back in September, which is when our financial year starts. So 3 factors that I explained to my customers, the reasons why we're increasing our price is weather, exchange rate, and the current pandemic. So explain to them that the wheat market's gone up around 19%. And so that's one factor. Overall, so that's raw material cost. That's down to the weather conditions. So when they were actually planting the crop to be harvested for this current year, we've already been impacted because of bad weather. Exchange rate, it's probably one of the most expensive we've seen in a while to purchase wheat, especially if it's traded in dollars. And on top of that, the global uncertainty of everyone trying to hold on to their exports rather than sending it out to other countries, because we didn't know how long this lockdown was going to last for. So I looked at those 3 reasons. Obviously, that makes it a little bit easier to digest for some of our customers. Regardless, it's still quite a difficult conversation to have. And some of the guys are really struggling with, it's not just us. We know the rest of the market has gone up as well because everyone's suffering this, all our competitors are. But still, it's still quite a difficult conversation to have when, those who are delivering to the restaurants and takeaways that are either closing, haven't opened, and don't want to shift their operations to takeaways, they're suffering altogether.
Presumably, what matters to your clients and to you is the absolute price increase rather than the percentage price increase. So to take for example, taking rice, I have no idea, but I'm going to make a guess that the cost to buy rice is, 100 quid a ton, and you're selling it at, for want of a better phrase, £200 a ton, and the balance is packaging, transport, marketing, distribution, all the other things that organizations do that add value. So if the price of the rice has gone up from £100 a ton to £120 a ton, then your price to your customers could go up from £200 a ton to £220 a ton, whilst you will make exactly the same absolute amount of money. Now, you make a lower percentage amount of money, and that's partly an internal organizational issue about what the organization values. But the PR, the benefits in terms of PR is you're able to say the underlying rice price has gone up by 20%, and we've only put the price of our rice up by 10%. And that is, of course, because a large component of the price your customers are paying is not the underlying price. So it's the opposite of a petrol station to some degree, where actually it's not because of tax, but if you took out tax, they are just flogging basically the stuff what came from the ground and through a refinery, and therefore the underlying petrol price should be a huge proportion of the price at the tank. I know it's actually completely factually incorrect, but you understand the principle. And so some sort of transparency on there. So almost having, for example, putting it as your price has been held the same, but there's an additional surcharge for changes in the in the commodity market is it doesn't help your customers if it's going to send them bust. Clearly, it's at the end of the day, what counts to them is the money. But in terms of making it clear that it's not ABF that is price gouging, it is all directly attributable to the underlying commodity cost. At least helps somewhat, I would think.
I think as well. I mean, your customers are going to be aware, because you're not going to be the only one coming to them with this message, are you? I mean, your competitors are going to be saying similar things because similar factors impact them. So that gives you credibility. They know you're telling the truth because that's what the market says is happening. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. And great example there, Anil. Thank you for talking us through that. We've got a question here from Lee about price points and changeability. Lee, do you want to ask your question? Lee, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I was just taking myself off of mute. So obviously it sounds like life's very changeable in terms of pricing, and as well as supply and demand for items that were maybe unexpected, as Janet has already mentioned, around hot tubs. So with pricing strategies maybe being not quite clear and things being a bit unsettled, what sort of impact do you think that will have on the rest of that organisation?
Should we start with you, Janet?
Which organisation? The one that's buying or the one that's selling?
Well, the one that's selling.
Well, again, I'm sorry to keep sort of saying it depends, but it does sort of depend, because everything could be absolutely fine up until this point, and then something like Anil was saying, something that's going on in Russia could impact it, or we've still, what if the crops fail? Okay, I don't pretend to be an expert, but we've had a very high spring, so very dry spring, so what impact is that going to have, say, on hay? Look, as businesses, if you're running a business, you've got to be prepared to be flexible and to embrace change. All right, this is on a scale that perhaps we haven't experienced before, but if you're heading up strategy in your business and you haven't reevaluated your business plan from whatever you thought it was you were doing at the end of 2019, because I bet your business plan looks extremely different now, then you're not leading your company properly. Look, there's always unexpected things happening. You have to be able to change. Even big organizations who aren't traditionally that good at changing fast have had to change fast. So I think you've got to know your numbers and you've got to be prepared. You've got to have the mindset to be able to change. That's my view.
So know your numbers and developing that agile mindset and being really willing to shift rapidly is key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Richard, what are your thoughts on that question?
I think whether you have to change depends absolutely on what you do. So, for example, if you look at our market, if you look at apprenticeships per se, which is one of the markets JGA is in, our clients in terms of employers are actually price insensitive, at least for our kind of stuff, where they're buying relatively small number of apprenticeships, and that's because there's a funding band, and the quality is really important, and it's more important to them than knocking a couple of quid off the price. And anyway, it's all for the levy payers, so the big companies, it's all money which has been taken off as a tax, and they lose if they don't spend it. So their priority actually is to get value for the money rather than knocking 5 or 10% off the price. So in that sense, it's very price insensitive. Now, on the other hand, who governs what the maximum I can charge is? It's the government. The government says the maximum thou shalt charge for this program is X amount. So actually, the buyer is not the person setting the price in a macro sense at the moment. It may change over time in our industry. And so our industry pricing is unaffected. But our volumes, of course, in terms of people starting on program, absolutely affected, because other companies, our client organizations, are worried about what's going to happen, or they furloughed people, or whatever it may be. So it is a case of adapting, and pricing is one of a package of how you run your organization, both marketing mix and more broadly, in terms of your ability to adapt? Do you furlough someone, or do you invest in new products while people have the time and the bandwidth to do it? There are lots of choices. I think life is one full of set of choices for organizations as well as individuals, and how you adapt very much depends on the choices you make, and how much leeway you've given yourself. If your organization is got lots of debt and nothing in the bank, then you ain't got a lot of leeway. If you've got money in the bank and no debt, then you've got far more leeway, and you actually hope in the medium term to benefit, and you change your pricing policy, if you can change your pricing policy to fit that set of needs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Richard. So as we come towards the end of the webinar, before we do the exercise, oh, Biddy, you've put a comment in there for Anna about rice. Do you want to quickly talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. No, I was just saying to Neil that as a consumer of rice, I've noticed that there's been price rises. But watching some of the cooking programs, there's been a lot of variety in recipes and using different forms of rice for different dishes. And I've mainly been a consumer as in the Asian market for basmati rice. But now I'm using long grain basmati wild black rice. So there's a differential in my approach. And maybe that might impact the wholesale market in terms of what's in it for me type of approach, the Witham factor. That's it.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. So what we've seen as well is, so traditionally for everyone on the call, basmati is a lot more expensive than long grain. Key differentials between the rice is basmati is usually grown in India or Pakistan, has a nice fragrant smell to it, medium grain, long grains a lot longer, and no smell. So what people have done is tried to shift from, this including chefs and loads of YouTube experts on food, they've tried to replace basmati with long grain. Now that's trying to adjust to help people in the current situation. You will see a massive difference in your dish. The grains will be longer, so it'll probably be filling you up quicker, but then you won't have the same taste. So finding substitutes for products such as rice, is common. But one of the things businesses like ours need to be wary of is this a long-term shift? And I think it's just about spotting where everything is moving, because about 40 years ago, we started seeing a change in the Afro-Caribbean market where people were moving from an easy cook rice, so similar to what you would get in a Turkish cuisine. With bulgur, you'd get easy cooked, slightly puffy rice. They're moving from there to a sort of hybrid basmati rice. So we see shifts and changes all over the place. I'm sure different markets will see sort of people trying to be smarter and just trying to judge where we're going with the future.
Thank you, Anil. That's really interesting and a great point, Biddy, because that's what got us all thinking about how, if there are going to be some shifts in consumer habits, as you say, it'd be interesting to see whether those are going to be long-term changes and whether that's going to have a longer-term impact on pricing as well. Perhaps if consumers and also businesses are trying different products, and they actually there's some advantages to this. Richard, I can see you're dying to say something.
It is fair to say we haven't talked about substitute products and products that go accompany complementary products and got into the whole economics of pricing. But if you take my apprenticeships as an example, for instance, clearly there are different ways to run an apprenticeship. You could have more contact with your coach and tutor or less contact. It could be all digital, or it could be physical in one place. And clearly all of those have different cost structures. And one thing COVID has done, not just in training, but in wide swathes of the economy, is make people think, well, actually, we could do more digital on a permanent basis. And therefore, there is potentially a cost benefit. So then it comes down to who determines the price. So in our particular case, where the government determines the maximum price, I would very much hope that it wouldn't lead to prices going down. In other situations or other industries, or if a large employer came to me with 100 apprentices, for example, and said, I want to negotiate on price, then you've got more flexibility if you've got a lower cost base than if you're doing it with a higher set of cost structures. So there is that whole alternatives. If, for instance, it would get too expensive, people would do it from non-apprenticeship learning. So there are substitute products for most products, and that rice is a classic example. And that's what, at the end of the day, determines the immediate short-term pricing decision. Can I switch? How much power does my supplier or my client have? How long term do I want our relationship to be? What are my competitors doing? All the stuff that the people doing sales will know about day in, day out, because you're fighting against your competition every day, with every client. But yes, those whole issues around substitute products and complementary products we haven't really covered, but they definitely make a difference in how you price.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great point, Richard. So on that note, it would be brilliant to hear from all of our delegates today about, based on what you've learned, because we've covered a lot of ground, from the underlying relationship that you've got with people, right through to how some of those future changes that we're already starting to see and your business models will be impacting all of this stuff. It would be great to hear how your approach to pricing might have changed as a result of what you've heard today from our fantastic speakers. So if you'd like to put that in the chat, that would be great. Alternatively, if you want to put your hand up, we'll come to you, but I'm going to give you a moment to do that now. How is your approach to pricing going to change based on what you've learned today?
I'd be interested to see if anyone's going to change the sort of rice they buy.
I'm already thinking about that, actually. So is anyone going to change their approach to pricing?
Personally or as an organisation, Zoe?
Sorry, say that again.
Personally, in terms of approach to buying, or as an organisation in their approach to selling?
Organisationally. Anyone got any thoughts on that? So is everyone just going to continue with their current approach then? Oh, Rebecca, you've got a point here. Do you want to talk us through that?
Hi, sorry, it's Rebecca here. I just wrote a note. That's just what I can add. I have no input in pricing whatsoever in any part of the company. So I can't really say anything about it, even though it's great learning. It's good to hear feedback, obviously, and you never know, it might be helpful for myself for the future. But going forward in my job role, there's nothing I do regarding pricing. So
how is pricing determined, Rebecca? Who does it?
So I work for a logistics company, and that is to do with the sales and pricing team. So I don't know how exactly what it works, but we do various modes of transport, from air freight to sea freight, road freight. So I know things have changed, obviously, but I don't know how it works really.
Okay. Well, maybe spend a couple of hours with the pricing team, and quite apart from anything else, it'd be 2 hours off the job learning you can do for your apprenticeship if you're on an apprenticeship. But it is useful because you can't take a view overall whether you're on the bid team or marketing or sales. It's always good to know the context of what you do and what pulls people's triggers, and what does the pricing team need to know in future to help it decide the right price. Is it cost plus? Are they just saying these are our costs, we'll add 5%, or it is useful to know. And I say that someone who's come up a career path, probably fairly similar to most people on this call, whereas I started on customer service and doing in the sales and marketing function of the steel company, and then I went into inside sales, and I did outside sales, and I did a gopher job, and I did a strategy job, and I left, and so forth. And if the more senior you aspire to be, and I hope that everybody on this call really does aspire to really go places in their career, the more understanding context is an absolute necessity, because that's what enables people to make good decisions and good suggestions, rather than just what they do.
Absolutely. And as Richard says, it might be that when you go and spend some time with that team, they might be struggling, and they might be thinking, well, we don't have all the answers on this, so they might well welcome some fresh thinking and a bit of a different input. Brilliant. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what you can do, Rebecca. Jill's put a really good comment in here about how pricing probably won't change, but they are very keen to keep their loyal customers, but won't be putting up prices for the time being. Jill, is there anything else you want to add about that?
So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
No, we're a well-established company and we've got a lot of loyal customers. We're in agriculture, so it's quite a tentative area anyway with pricing. So yeah, we'll keep the prices the same, I imagine. And also, we just wouldn't do ourselves any favours with these customers. Everyone talks, don't they? You know, in agriculture, everyone seems to be related to each other. Me being one of them. So yeah, it wouldn't do us any favours at all. We have been tempted, admittedly, initially, because we had PPE equipment and hand sanitizer, things like that. But you know, I did put my foot down to start off with and say we really aren't going to do ourselves any favours. So we've just kept it at the normal recommended retail price as we would have done before we sort of went down with this.
A lot of the time, I think it's making that decision. Is this an investment? Will I get payback? And I mean, not necessarily explicitly, but if you're nice to people and you don't put up prices when they really need you not to, will you get benefits in the longer term from that, building that relationship? Or will it just be a market where they go off and deal with someone else next week anyway? Or it might be a broader issue. It might be a community issue. What happens if it gets into the trade press that you are selling PPE and you stuck the prices up and trebled them? And you might not care, or you might absolutely care. And those are the sorts of decisions that you clearly were making, and Rebecca, and sounds like you're doing good, right things.
Brilliant. Thank you. Some great points there as we draw to a close. Thank you very much for that, Jill. That's brilliant and very thought-provoking on reputation and how having that benchmarking and context is everything as we all look to what we're going to do with our pricing after today. So thank you so much, everyone, for a really interesting, really helpful discussion. Please do share your feedback about today's session as well. I think Jubril has just put that link in the chat. A massive thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all of our delegates for a really helpful and very wide-ranging discussion today. Next Monday at the same time, 12 till 1, we will be talking about distribution, and there will be a question to think about before then, which is about how the COVID-19 crisis has changed how you distribute your products and services. So we'll look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. So thank you so much to the panel. Richard.
Sorry, could I just make one closing remark? I think one thing out of today has been, be interested in pricing. Don't just assume that pricing is fixed. It's a subtle tool. It can reflect your customers' needs. It can reflect your costs. It can reflect demand levels. It can reflect how you want to be perceived. It says a lot about you to people out there, to your clients and the wider community. And make sure that you do try and understand how pricing is set. And some people will be in industries that are pretty much a commodity industry and there's not much you can do. And other people will be at the exact opposite end of the scale. But everyone at the commodity industry, you can bet your bottom dollar a lot of organization will be trying to move away from the commodity side and understand their pricing a bit better and what they can do to add value in the marketing mix elsewhere. Sorry about that.
No, that's a really good point, because if I think about some of the organisations I've worked with and for previously, pricing was very much approached in a silo, and I think what today's discussion has really revealed that we need to think about it much more widely as a multifaceted thing that it is. So thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you coming. Thank you again, Richard and Janet, our wonderful panellists. And we look forward to seeing you all same time next week to talk about COVID-19 and distribution of products and services. Thanks again for coming, everyone. And thank you again to our panellists.
Thank you, Zoe.
Bye.